Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Jason Willick. Subscribe at undercurrents.tv to join the Undercurrents community for just $1 for your first month. You get special paywalled episodes, an email address where you can reach us, and more. Subscribe here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts as well. Now on to the news. The biggest foreign policy news in a generation seemed to come down on Tuesday night when Donald Trump, at a joint press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu, announced the U.S. would take over the Gaza Strip. It was sudden, inflammatory, out of the box, and very, very Trumpian. So I wanted to let the dust settle a bit before diving too deep. The reaction was very interesting. Some in MAGA world hated the announcement, some embraced it, and others just assumed it was a negotiating tactic like the 25% tariffs. After a lot of speculation, Trump himself posted on Truth Social yesterday, quote, "The Gaza Strip would be turned over to the United States by Israel at the conclusion of fighting. The Palestinians," people like Chuck Schumer, I don't know what Trump meant with like that, but he continues to say, "would have already been resettled in a far safer and more beautiful communities with new and modern homes in the region. They would actually have a chance to be happy, safe, and free. The U.S., working with great development teams from all over the world, would slowly and carefully begin the construction of what would become one of the greatest and most spectacular developments of its kind on Earth. No soldiers by the U.S. would be needed. Stability for the region would reign." So that statement, actually written out, clarifies a couple of things about Trump's plan. Israel would just give Gaza to the U.S. after the conclusion of the fighting, he said, which would work with then private developers to build up the region in a way that would not require boots on the ground. Part one of that plan, though, is a fantasy non-starter unless Trump is encouraging more violence contra the ceasefire deal that his team helped negotiate. So I wrote for Unheard on Wednesday that any takeover of the Gaza Strip would just not come peacefully because Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced last month, quote, then Secretary of State, I should say, "we assess that Hamas has recruited almost as many new militants as it has lost." And Hamas, unsurprisingly, called Trump's new plan, quote, "a crime against humanity." Saudi Arabia and Turkey oppose Trump's plan, and other countries whose cooperation would be key are likely to follow them. If the U.S. and Israel want to move the people of Gaza, who have fought for years, for generations, to stay on their land, it will require force, barring some significant unforeseen development. Hamas controls what is left of Gaza. Hamas will spill much blood to fight Trump's plan. Israel will not be in a position, barring a lot more fighting, to merely hand the territory over to the U.S., even if Trump brought together other Arab nations and private developers. There would have to be a lot more fighting. That's the bottom line. Now, one source in the White House told me MAGA world is of two minds. There is the ideological-driven crowd versus the people who solely exist to advance the Trump agenda. At times, they overlap. If you're upset about the president not adhering to your niche ideology, you should reconsider your line of work. The mandate voters gave us was for Trump and his vision, the source added, not for junior staff to mouth off. And I thought that was important as we try to figure out where all of this leaves us. The incoherence of the plan that Trump laid out this week suggests to me that it may just have been him vision casting to shift the Overton window for further negotiations. But as with the tariffs, that only works if nobody can confidently gauge what he actually thinks, and that includes us. Secretary of State Rubio, meanwhile, initially embraced the plan. He's been on a swing of Latin America, securing a win against China in Panama and meeting with Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. Rubio is also at the center of the USAID drama that we covered earlier this week with Christian Parenti. The downsized agency is now under his control at state, and Rubio, a former backer of USAID, has supported its dismantling this week. USAID is the encapsulation of soft power gone awry. So is Trump's plan to draw back America's footprint and stop policing the world? Quote, "It is not the duty of U.S. troops to solve ancient conflicts in faraway lands that many people have never even heard of," he told cadets at West Point's graduation in 2020. "We are not the policemen of the world," end quote. Is his plan to enforce American hegemony just more pragmatically? There's so many questions about what actually is going on in this new Trump administration as it approaches foreign policy very aggressively right out the gate. Jason Willick covers foreign policy as a columnist for The Washington Post. He is consistently the paper's most interesting writer. He is a must-read, and he understands these dynamics very well, so I'm very excited to say that Jason Willick of The Washington Post joins us now here in Undercurrents. Jason, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you, Emily.
Okay, Jason, I just want to start with a basic question. You study foreign policy really closely. You cover Trump's foreign policy. What did you make of the fairly surprising announcement, fairly sudden announcement that the US was, in his words, taking over the Gaza Strip on Tuesday night through the prism of what this kind of means for the right MAGA foreign policy going forward?
Well, it's like the least MAGA thing ever from the perspective of, more US troops in the Middle East. Trump basically ran against that. It's very MAGA in the sense of sort of blowing up a status quo type of negotiation that's been going on for decades without any real progress. So I think just looking at the Israeli response, which has been fairly positive, it's sort of like, well, thank goodness we're talking about something different now. So
Mm.
I think, it's not going to happen, but it may cause a more interesting conversation in the next few years about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been like the intractable foreign policy issue for decades.
One thing I heard from some people inside Trump world is that their theory is this was maybe intended to surprise Netanyahu and to catch him off guard was something. Do you have any thoughts on whether that seems plausible or why Trump would want to do that?
It sounds like they had a great visit, all the
Yeah.
reports from Trump and Netanyahu. There's some question, some bad feelings between them from some things at the end of the first term, from the Soleimani strike, other things. Not everyone in Trump world is hugely pro-Israel. So there was some question. So I think it turned out to be an extremely positive. I think they vibed, as the saying goes, Trump and Netanyahu, these two leaders. So I don't think he was trying to undermine him. I think that he pleased Netanyahu and Netanyahu pleased him. I do think Trump likes to always keep people guessing and keep people off guard. That seems to be one of his strategies. But what he would get out of it, I think, is basically just a more open discussion of the Middle East that's not, constricted by the two-state solution process.
Right. So he's now saying, no U.S. troops would be necessary. And the White House's line is that he is not committed to sending any U.S. troops because, to your point, it would be the least MAGA thing ever to say we are now going to nation build with boots on the ground in the Gaza Strip. But at the same time, it's almost impossible to imagine how the U.S. would just be given the Gaza Strip by Israel, from Israel, which is literally what Trump said on Truth Social recently, that the U.S. would take over the Gaza Strip after Israel wins it in the war. So at the same time, it's sort of like, what is he really saying? Is it a negotiation tactic? That's kind of the big question. What do you make of it, Jason?
I think one thing the Israelis wanted, and some people wanted, was during the war, during the active phase of fighting in Gaza, was for women and children to leave Gaza and go to Egypt and Jordan.
Mm.
And of course, those countries did not want that. They see the Palestinians as a political problem and did not want them in their countries. So I think, insofar as you're talking about Trump putting more pressure in case of further fighting to move some refugees temporarily,
Mm.
that's a fairly mainstream idea. That's something that's been discussed. Probably fewer women and children would have died if neighboring countries had been more open to taking refugees. So that's sort of one piece of it, is Palestinians moving. The second piece, but of course, if the fighting is over, that's a different question of moving people around. The second point about the United States taking over the Gaza Strip and turning it into, as I think he said, a place for everybody, like not Palestinian territory, but some sort of international territory. Again, that I think is a non-starter unless you're talking about sort of rebuilding Gaza with US funds, US and Arab funds, because a lot of people have been debating what's the post-war rebuilding plan for Gaza going to look like. Most people assume it's going to involve Arab money, the Palestinian Authority, the EU, maybe the United States. So maybe Trump is talking about U.S. involvement in the rebuilding. But this is one of those things where I think you have to take seriously, not literally. And the only thing that I can really take concretely from this is we need to think outside the box on this problem because it's not been working what we're doing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think the Israelis like the idea, Gaza has been controlled by Egypt in the past. It's now basically Israel's responsibility, or will be after the war. I think the Israelis like the idea of not having responsibility over this territory. So they're like, hey, are other countries going to come in? Are the Americans going to help us?
Hmm.
Even Netanyahu's opposition in Israel, the liberal opposition, has basically responded positively to this, just because I think it's a sign that we're gonna try something new here.
Part of what I think surprised me most is that Trump rushed to negotiate the ceasefire via Steve Witkoff before Biden formally left office, and seemed like what he wanted to do was put this current conflict in the rearview mirror as he took office and sort of not have it on his watch. So I was partially surprised that he decided to wade into the controversy, the intractable conflict, in such a dramatic fashion this week. I don't know. I mean, a lot of the talk this week has been Trump believes manifest destiny is the way to sort of be remembered in American history. When people look back, and he's kind of trying to be, what did the White House call him, peacemaker in chief around the world, and that's how he envisions his legacy. Is there anything to those dynamics? Like, what do you make of that analysis, Jason? That this is part of Trump's legacy building?
Well, I'll say this about Trump and trying to negotiate peace in the Middle East. Some people immediately said, well, why didn't Biden lean on the Israelis to get this ceasefire deal? It was a similar deal. I think the Israelis trust Trump a lot more. And when he says
Mm.
things like this, that makes them like him more. They think basically Trump is on our side. Trump wants us to win. Trump understands the threat from Iran. So the idea that it can be all stick, that you could just pressure the Israelis into doing something isn't true. You also have to have carrot. And Trump totally understands carrot and stick and threats and inducements and all this. So I think he, the Netanyahu's right-wing coalition and the people on the right in Israel trust Trump in a way that they didn't trust Biden, and feel that he's basically on their side. And so in that sense, that gives him room then to pressure them and to agree to do things that they might not do under pressure from a Democratic or liberal president who they're suspicious is going to sell them out. So I do think Trump's sort of negotiating position with the Israelis and Palestinians, he has more leverage over the Israelis than Biden did, in part because the Israelis think he's really pro-Israel.
A lot of bluster over Iran this week, and a lot of the people, to your point, who really do trust Trump and is to Netanyahu's right, were really unhappy with the ceasefire negotiation, and would be really unhappy if Donald Trump did an Iran deal 2.0 that was maybe a little bit different from the Obama-Iran nuclear deal, but had some of the same architecture. What do you make about how we could expect Trump to navigate that going forward?
I mean, the first term we saw maximum pressure. We saw, the Soleimani strike. If it's a choice between war with Iran and a deal with Iran, clearly Trump prefers deals, but he also, kind of likes surprising gestures that keep people off guard. The military strike on Soleimani, as opposed to a war with Iran. Netanyahu doesn't want war with Iran. I mean, that's one thing people don't realize.
Hmm.
There's been this question, when is Israel going to attack Iran's nuclear sites, for over a decade? And Netanyahu has never done it. And when Netanyahu came to the US Congress to talk about opposing the nuclear deal, he said the alternative isn't war, it's a better deal. So I think if you could squeeze out a better deal, the
Hmm.
Israelis might well be happy with that. If it's just a symbolic renegotiation, like you said, less so. And Trump is definitely one for theater and for saying that he, made a new deal when it's actually similar to what came before. But I don't know. The vibes again from this visit was that they're kind of on the same
Hmm.
page.
This is all happening. Marco Rubio is in Latin America. He's talking to Bukele. He negotiates with Panama to stop Belt and Road and Panama Canal and all of that. Rubio is such an interesting figure, and he's one that you've covered really closely for a while. As the Secretary of State to this, quote, out of the box type of thinking from Donald Trump, what do you expect to see? Obviously, we expect loyalty from Marco Rubio to Donald Trump. He tweeted in favor of the Gaza plan after it happened, at least in a very broad sense. Who knows what he actually thought about the particulars, but is Rubio really going to be sort of the Trump ambassador on this quest of North American manifest destiny? I just don't know what to expect right now, given what happened over the course of the last week and how Rubio, I think, handled very successfully his Latin America trip. What's going on between those two?
And interesting stuff is going on with Marco Rubio, right? Because he was initially the Tea Party guy. He was kind of the reform, forward-looking conservative guy who the establishment could work with. Now there's a sense he's brought on, or at least the State Department has Michael Anton as the
Mm-hmm.
director of policy planning. They brought on Darren Beattie in a public affairs role. These are some, more sort of regime critics or quite conservative right wing figures. So I think one thing we can expect from Rubio in terms of the State Department is doing more culture war stuff around the world. Like we just
Mm.
saw him say he's going to boycott an event in South Africa based on things that South Africa is doing. I could see them saying we don't like the way that Europe is censoring speech. We don't like the way Canada is doing euthanasia. I could see them sort of bringing a more conservative approach because historically secretaries of state have been sort of ambassadors of democracy and for American democracy. But I think Marco Rubio and some of the people around him see this very differently. They see some of these democracies in Western Europe, you know, doing a lot of censorship and doing a lot of quite illiberal things. So I think we're going to see Rubio express sort of a more conservative cultural vision around the world in his diplomacy rather than the more traditional, Secretary of State. And obviously, like you said, one of his priority is North America. He hasn't been so involved in the Middle East stuff so far. And
Hmm.
then, he's obviously someone I think who's looking to 2028, and it'll be interesting to see how he positions himself for in this really important job for the rest of his political career.
This is such a minor subplot that mostly Beltway people care about. I do just want to ask you more about the Darren Beattie appointment because I was honestly surprised by it. Someone who obviously left the first Trump administration after it came out that he had spoken to a white nationalist conference. He founded Revolver News. He's a very, I guess, unorthodox character, a very aggressive character, somewhat interesting from an ideological standpoint. So for Rubio to bring him in, I think it really undermines the point you're making. He's leaning into this kind of culture war diplomacy. I'm sure Rubio himself wasn't involved in the appointment, or maybe he was. Maybe you know better than I do. But were you surprised by that? Does that tell us anything? I mean, I think Beattie's sort of an Anton type figure, but more aggressive, more activist oriented. I don't know. What did you make of that, Jason?
Yeah, that was quite striking because again, Marco Rubio, confirmed 99-0 by the
Right.
Senate. There's a sense, well, this is going to be a point of continuity. The State Department's going to be a point of continuity
Mm.
with compared to the rest of the Trump disruption. I don't think that's what Rubio and the people around him have in mind, and we've already seen that with USAID and the way that they're sort of shaking up that institution. So I think anybody who hoped, well, this is going to be the Trump figure who's really like the old guard and who is more recognizable, old-fashioned conservative is going to basically be disappointed, at least if it's somebody who wants a political future in the Republican Party. So I think, yeah, like you said on the appointments, I don't know the exact process, but I think we're going to see a pretty aggressive edge to some of this diplomacy. And again, you just look at the way conservatives have been thinking of the world. I mean, we really more have liberals now as Atlanticists who look more to Europe, and conservatives looking at the Western Hemisphere, looking at Asia. I think there's this old assumption that, well, Western democracies in Europe and Canada are our people. And I don't think that the Rubio State Department or the Trump administration sees that. They probably see more in common with like UKIP in the UK than the Keir Starmer government in some ways. So I think that's going to be very interesting if you look at the transatlantic relations, especially.
Hmm. Yeah, Trump likes Bukele, I think, for some obvious reasons. Marco Rubio's relationship with Bukele is interesting because Rubio is obviously the son of Cuban immigrants, and he's always been a Cuba hawk, a communist hawk, super hawkish on China for a lot of the reasons that people in the Cold War were hawkish on the Soviet Union and on Cuba and actually on China too. But it feels to me like the end of USAID is almost symbolic of the end of like soft power or hard power masquerading as soft power, of this pretense that the Atlanticists have looked to for a really long time. Is this the turn towards like multipolar realism, or is it actually just going to be further attempts at like hegemony and soft power, but with different pretenses? Like, are we just swapping out one pretense for another?
I think the thing with Trump, like I distinguish between like institutional MAGA and Trump.
Right,
There's an
right.
institutional MAGA and kind of a disciplined MAGA point of view that studied Trump and tried to create a foreign policy around America interests that's very theoretically rigorous. And, this is the MAGA foreign policy. And then there's Trump, and he just, lobs these bombs like the Gaza remarks that throw everything off kilter. So I think everyone's always trying to make sense of of Trump's foreign policy and put it in an ideological box, and then it can surprise us. On USAID, I think basically it's another edge of this culture war thing we talked about. There's a sense like a lot of these programs are just funding sort of a vision of national improvement and government that we don't like, and it's actually it's supposedly to make the world more like America, but it's actually amplifying parts of America we don't like. So we're going after it, for political reasons. So I could see the Trump people being fine with soft power if they think it's a soft power tool that's more aligned with conservative values.
Hmm. That is really interesting. I mean, that's the thing with Trump is it's so hard to disentangle institutional MAGA, broader conservative movement from the man himself, who honestly, tell me if I'm wrong on this, but my take is that he's not a foreign policy ideologue, unless that ideology is I guess America first in the most literal sense that like this has to be strictly in America's best interest.
Yeah. I mean, he's more transactional than usual. And in a lot of cases, he's not actually more transactional than previous presidents. He's just more upfront about it. And he doesn't use the same vocabulary that is used to sort of conceal that what we're really doing is a transactional or self-interested arrangement. And we're not going to hide our self-interest behind, phrases like rules-based international order. We're just going to say it's our self-interest. I think transactionality is the number one feature in his foreign policy. And, we just had a piece in the Post by Graham Allison talking about Trump and China. I mean, that's something to watch. I don't think he wants to have a war with China. I think he would love to make a deal with China. So it's deals, but it's deals from a position of strength, and it's a willing to really coerce and use the carrot and stick against both allies and enemies in a way that most people have been loath to do. Most presidents have been loath to do.
And China is where I was going to turn to lastly, because there are real ideologues, hawkish ideologues on China in the administration, but also in the sort of institutional MAGA world. And I do think there's tension between how they see China and how Trump sees China. Do you think that's true, Jason? I may be completely off on that. Obviously, Bridge Colby is in the administration. He's at the Pentagon. Kind of hard to know what Pete Hegseth believes beyond sort of like reactions in various circumstances. I would say he's probably best pegged generally as a China hawk. But is it possible that that comes to a head, that there's actually an extension of what Trump saw as the foreign policy deep state in his own administration that has different ideas from him about Taiwan and managing that conflict?
Remember, in Trump's first term, one of the first calls he took was from Tsai Ing-wen, the president of Taiwan, congratulating him. The Trump-Abe bond with Japan, our most important ally in Asia, was really pronounced in the first term. So far, this first term, the first few weeks, we've seen a lot about Latin America, and we've seen some Middle East. We haven't seen as much of that Asia focus. And of course, we've seen the TikTok, Trump giving TikTok a pass. I think that there's some on the very far right who also, think, well, a war with China is just another, that's the latest sort of neocon kind of distortion of American foreign policy. So there is a spectrum, like you said. I think, and I really don't know what to expect, but I think Trump, his remarks to John Bolton about how far away Taiwan is and stuff, I think a pretty clear read of Trump is that he's not eager to saber rattle there. I think he wants to stay unpredictable, but I think we're not seeing as much China hawkishness as you might have expected if you went to 2020 during COVID and the way the first Trump administration was talking about China and Asia.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Jason Willick, I could keep going on this for a long time, but I just appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
No, thanks, Emily. I'm a big fan of the show.
Appreciate it. Super interesting to have Jason here. Obviously, there was a lot of foreign policy news this week, and it's really hard sometimes to piece all of the different puzzle pieces together into something coherent and makes sense. Just because, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Trump has a very, whatever you think of him, ideologically dynamic movement around him. There are a lot of people coming from a lot of different places. So as you're piecing together their public statements and reports about their private statements together with what Trump says, which is often sort of spur of the moment and not scripted like a lot of other politicians, let alone a lot of other presidents, you end up with a hodgepodge. And to have Jason here to kind of work through that was really helpful. I think it, is helpful in decoding everything and predicting maybe what we could see with more clarity from the future. So appreciate Jason being here. Appreciate you for tuning in. You can join the Undercurrents community. It's just $1 for your first month over at undercurrents.tv. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for subscribing, for commenting, for leaving reviews here on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. We appreciate it so much, and we will be back with more Undercurrents soon.